Hey guys, Alex is back here with another episode. So in this tutorial, I'd like to talk about iterators and specifically the new for-of iterator in ES6. But before we dive into that, I want to first go over the different ways to iterate through objects and arrays in JavaScript. So let's begin with objects. So let's say we have a function that's going to be a function constructor, and we want to create a blueprint for a car object or car class. And let's say a car might have a make, it might have a model, and it might have a year, right? So basically we're just going to assign all of them to the local or internal properties like so. And lastly the year, this year equals year, okay? And then let's create an instance of the car class, car equals new car, and maybe the make would be Toyota. I'm not really into cars, but let's say Camry, maybe 2017. Okay. So what are the different ways to loop through the object properties? Well, one of them is for in. And for in loop, basically it does exactly that. It allows you to enumerate over object properties. So the way you would do that is you would basically have for, and you might have your variable. You could either use var, or you could use let. I'm going to use let just because of scoping, because we don't want to expose the properties outside of the loop. So we might have let prop in car, and let's do console log prop. And of course that's going to give us the three properties, make, model, and year. Now let's say we wanted to extend the car prototype. Let's say we wanted to add a method on it. So we might do something like car prototype, and let's add a drive function or drive method. Maybe it accepts the speed by which the car is going to go. So in this case, we might actually add a new property. Let's say speed, and let's initialize it to 0 by default. And once you call that function, it's basically going to assign the new speed value, like so. Now, what do you think is going to happen right now? If you look at the output right there, not only do we get the make, model, year, and speed, like the four properties that we define in the constructor function, but we also get the drive method. Now, in order to understand why this happens, you need to first remember that every single object in JavaScript has a prototype property. And basically, the prototype holds a reference to the parent object of that object. And this is basically how inheritance works in JavaScript. Like we talked about classes in one of the previous episodes, I mentioned that JavaScript does not have a class-based inheritance like other languages, namely, Java, C#, Ruby, PHP, whatnot. So those languages implement inheritance with classes. JavaScript implements inheritance with prototypes. So prototypes basically allow you to inherit properties of parent objects. So when you use the for in loop, one of the caveats of that loop is that basically it loops through all the properties along the entire prototype chain. So let's say if we have a car object right there, not only is the loop going to iterate over the four properties that we define in the constructor function, so that the direct properties or the properties that the object itself owns. So in this case, the car owns the make, model, year, and speed. But the for loop, it's also going to access the drive function on the prototype, because the loop is going to basically iterate through all the properties, including the ones in the prototype chain. So if you wanted to avoid the situation and not have the drive function be included, so if you basically wanted to iterate over the object's own properties, you could use the special has own property method. So you could do if car has own property, and then you pass that property in there, and then you indent it. And the output right there, as you can see, it's basically going to give you the object's own properties, the car's own properties, excluding any of the properties that are defined on the prototype. So this is a standard way to iterate over objects, but there's a few more that we want to look at. So another way to iterate over objects in ES5 actually. So this so far has nothing to do with ES6. I just want to go over the different ways to iterate objects and arrays. So one of the other ways to iterate objects would be to combine the use of Object.keys method as well as the Array.forEach method. And we're going to look at for each later in this video. But for now, let's say we do Object.keys. We're going to pass the car. object. Basically, if you wanted to console log that out, let's do that first, just to see what the output is going to be. That's going to give us an array with 4 properties: make, model, year, and speed. Now notice it doesn't give us the drive property that's defined on the prototype, and that's the expected behavior of Object.keys method. Basically, that method allows you to get access to the object's own properties, excluding any properties that are defined in the prototype chain. In this scenario, we don't need to use the has own property, and that's one of the advantages. So if you combine that with the forEach method, because the result of this call would be an array, so you could chain that with the forEach method. You can pass a callback function, and the very first argument would basically be the property or the key, right? You could call it a key. And then let's do console log of that key, right? That's going to give us all the 4 properties as we expect. Now, of course, in ES6, you can simplify this a little bit. You can remove the function keyword. You can remove the parentheses because you only have 1 argument. Then you put the arrow. You can also remove the curly braces, like so. We can bring all of this on just 1 line, like so. And it's going to give us the exact same result as before. Now, one of the cool things about the forEach function is that it not only allows you to iterate over elements of the array, it also allows you to get access to things like the index of the element as well as the array itself. So in this case, we're looping through the keys, right? We might just call it a key. Let's bring back the body of the function just to make it more readable. Let's do console log key, index, and the keys, and let's see what that gives us. Well, it's going to give us the 4 properties as you expect, but it's also going to give us the index, so from 0 to 3, and it's going to give us the array itself. So this is the array that the Object.keys method returns. This is the array that we apply the forEach method on. So that's another way to iterate over object properties. It's a little bit inefficient in that it's actually slower than the for-in approach. And the for-in loop, even to this day, remains one of the fastest and one of the simplest ways to iterate over objects. Now in ES6, we get introduced to the new for-of syntax. And the new for-of syntax, it basically allows you to loop through iterable objects. And those iterable objects include objects like array, string, but also the new map and set objects that we're going to cover on later in the series. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is, like I mentioned, the for-of syntax, it only works for iterable objects. So if you try to do, let's say, for let prop of car, well, that's not going to work. And if we tried console log prop, if you open up the console log, the DevTools in Chrome, you're going to see that it gives us the uncaught type error that car is not iterable. The message is going to look different if you're actually going to apply the Babel processor, as you see right there. So it's going to give us a little bit different message, but basically the essence is that you cannot iterate over simple objects like we have one here. What you can actually do is you could call the Object.keys on the car object. So this is going to give us an array, and now we're basically iterating through all the elements of that array, and it's going to give us the same 4 properties as before. And notice in this case, the advantage is that we are not iterating over the drive method, right? So the drive method is excluded from the result of the method call, the result of the keys call on the object class. And that's because the keys method returns only the object's own properties, meaning it excludes the ones that are defined on the prototype. Now, of course, if you wanted to iterate over the values of those properties, you could call Object.values method, and essentially that's going to give you all the values that those 4 properties hold. Now, when it comes to other approaches of iterating objects, different libraries might have different ways to achieve this result. So let's say in jQuery there's an each function where you basically pass the object and then you pass the callback function, which is going to have a key and a value. So this is how you would basically iterate over an object in jQuery. Of course, it's a little bit slower than using the traditional for-in loop, because in this case you're making a function call. It's going to take a little bit longer. In underscore, there's a forEach method, and there's also the alias each method, and you could use those on arrays as well as objects. And lastly, in Lodash, there's also a for each, there's an each alias, but besides there's also a for in, and there's even for own, which basically acts as a for in loop with the has own property check inside of it, so you don't have to implement that logic yourself. So this is pretty much it for iterating objects. What about iterating arrays? Well, let's say we had an array of cities. So we might have, let's say, Chicago, let's say New York, oops, let's say New York, let's say Los Angeles, let's say San Francisco, and maybe Houston. Okay. So let's say we wanted to iterate over the elements of that array. Well, one of the first things that you might reach out for is the for in loop, and it does have its own advantages and disadvantages, but as you're going to see, it's actually not designed for iterating over arrays. So let's say we had for let index in cities, and we do console log index, and we do console log cities index, like so. Well, the reason this works is that arrays are also objects, right? So every single element that we have in the array, well, it's basically assigned to an index, because arrays are essentially ordered collections of values. So every single value is assigned to an index. In this case, Chicago would be at index 0. So that 0 basically becomes the property. So you have something like 0, that's the property, it's assigned the value of Chicago. Then you have 1, that's assigned the value of New York, and so on. So the way this works is you basically use the loop to iterate through the properties or indices in the array, and then you can access the value of those properties when you apply the index on the array. And this seems to work, but the thing you need to keep in mind is that the for in loop, the traditional loop that we use for iterating objects, well, it's actually designed to enumerate object properties, and it's not really meant to be used when you want to iterate over array-like objects. So it's really best to avoid using the for in loop when you iterate over arrays, because first of all, the order of iteration is not guaranteed, meaning that the array indices may not necessarily be visited in sequential order. But the other reason is that the inherited properties will also be enumerated, and we saw this with objects in the previous example a couple of minutes before. But basically, when you're dealing with arrays, don't forget that those are also objects. So if you use the for in loop, well, it can actually bite you if you extend the array prototype, if you try to include a custom method there. This is actually something that might come up in older code bases, but basically JavaScript does not prevent you from extending the internal or built-in objects and their prototypes. So you might do something like array prototype, and then you might define a custom method on that prototype. So let's say, and really it's something that you shouldn't do, but in this example, let's do a simple silly example here. So let's assign a function to it, and it basically does console log, whoops, right? So let's say we did that, and you can already see in the output that when we use the for in loop, not only do we get the elements of the array, but we also get the custom method that we define on the array prototype. And this is something that you would expect, right? Because we saw this behavior with objects. Whenever you define a custom, or whenever you define a method on the prototype, that method is also going to be listed when you enumerate through the properties using the for in loop. And that's not a bug, that's basically how the for in loop works. Like I said before, multiple times, the for in loop doesn't only go through the object's own properties, it also goes through the entire prototype chain. So it's also going to touch on the properties that are defined on the prototype of that object. Now, this leads us to the philosophy that you should never really modify objects that you don't own. So doing something like this is really not advisable. I would really advise you not to do this ever. But you can run into the same problem if you use some kind of a library that does actually rely on extending native prototypes, and that might be the case especially for older libraries. But for now, just keep in mind that using the for in loop is not the best idea when you're working with arrays. So what are some of the alternatives when you want to iterate over arrays? One of the alternatives to the for in loop is to use the traditional for loop. So let's say we had an index here assigned to 0, because you want to begin, typically you begin with a zeros index. then you basically have a check that says index is less than city's length. It makes it the built-in property of any array in JavaScript, and then you increment the index like so. And then you have your body of the loop, and you can do console log cities index. And of course, that's going to give you the 5 cities as you would expect. Now, one of the other things that you might want to do is you might want to cache the length here. So you might define a second variable that's going to hold the value of city's length. And then instead of accessing the length on every single iteration, you might just put the length in there. So these two variables are going to be scoped to the body of the loop. They're not going to be accessible outside. And this length is going to be cached so that you don't access it multiple times through every single iteration. Now, in reality, the advantage of this caching is actually quite negligible. If you're on real actual tests, you're going to see that the difference is very tiny. And that's because the body of the loop takes a lot more processing power than doing the comparison condition right there. And in fact, modern GS engines, modern browsers will actually automatically perform this optimization for you, given that you reach a certain amount of iterations in your loop. So you might say that this trick right there that we did, it's sort of like a premature micro optimization that really doesn't make that much difference when you actually run your code. And the other disadvantage, or the inherent quality of this for loop, is that it's imperative. Now we're going to come back to this idea later, but basically when we're talking about imperative and declarative programming, in this case the for loop is imperative because we're basically describing how we want to iterate over the array here. We're basically explicitly saying, okay, you first have to define the index, then you want to check that that index is less than the length of the array in every single iteration, and once you finish iterating every single time, you want to increment that index. So we're basically describing, or we're basically laying out every single step for JavaScript and how we want to process this array instead of just processing it. So this approach is known as imperative, and this is in contrast to declarative approach, which we're going to see in a few seconds. The other way to iterate over arrays would be to use the forEach method. So every single array has a forEach method that's been added in ES5, and it basically allows you to pass a callback function. So you can have your city in the anonymous function, and you could just simply do console log that city. So the forEach method is basically going to go over every single element in the array, and it's going to pass that element to the callback function that you provide. So in this case, we're going to access the city. So compare this to the previous example where we had the for loop. We had to access the element of the array using cities and the brackets and then the index. Now in this case, you can access the city directly. So that's one of the advantages. Of course, in ES6, we can also simplify this. We could use the arrow function. We don't need the curly braces right there, so we can remove them completely. And we can put all of this into one line, like so, and it's going to give us the exact same result. And the other thing like I mentioned before, you're not limited to just the array elements, but you could also have access to the index in case you need to access it, and you can also have access to the array itself, so you might have your cities. So let's console log out the city, the index, and the cities themselves. Now the other thing is, don't forget that this function is an anonymous function, it's a callback function. So the cities variable right there, it's actually being scoped to this function, so it doesn't conflict with the cities variable outside of it, and it executes without any errors. So as you can see, we get the cities, we also get the index, and we also get the array of cities as the third element in the output. Now the other thing to note about this approach is that it's declarative. Now going back to the imperative and declarative paradigms in programming, when you're dealing with a declarative approach, it's basically concerned with what we want the result to be. So the declarative approach, as opposed to an imperative approach, it focuses on what the outcome needs to be rather than how it needs to be achieved. So notice in this case, we're not telling JavaScript how we want to iterate over the elements of the array. We're just saying, okay, just iterate over the elements. I don't care how you do it. I just want to have access to every single element, and I want to have my index, and I want to have my original array. Of course, those are optional. You can remove them. But in this case, the important thing is that we're not explicitly defining how the iteration needs to be implemented. And on the same note, the forEach method, it actually contains the imperative abstraction built into it. So the forEach method itself deals with iteration internally so that we don't have to concern ourselves with how that needs to be implemented or achieved. And then lastly, there's also in ES5 the map function. So the map function, it basically iterates over the elements of an array, and it invokes a callback function on every single element of that array. So in the end, the result of the call to the map function is going to give you a brand new array with the elements that you applied your callback or processing onto. So just to show how this works, we could have our cities, and we could call the map function, right? Pass the callback to it. You might have your city, and then we could basically do console log the city. Now this is not exactly the way that the map function is supposed to be used. In fact, if you do let new cities and you try to console log that out after the map function has been executed, that's going to give you an array of undefined. Like I said, this is not really the way that the map function is supposed to be used. The way it's supposed to be used is you are basically returning a new element for every single element that you iterate over. So in this case, the map function is meant to be used with the return keyword. You could return the city, right, like so, but it makes more sense to modify the city string right there. So we might do something like, let's do something silly. Let's say I love, and then the city, right? So that's going to give us the output right there. Okay. The other thing is we could also use string interpolation. So we could use the backticks and ES6. So we could do something like this, right? So we put the closing quote right there, and then we put the $sign and the curly braces around it, like so. So the city is going to be injected into the string. And of course, the other thing we could do is we could also use the arrow functions, like so. We can remove the curly braces, right? And the return keyword would be implicit, so we don't actually need it. Put it on the same line, and we get this result. That's going to give us the exact same output as before. So like I said before, in this case, the map function, it's going to execute a callback for every single element in that array. It's going to apply that logic for those elements, and it's going to return a brand new array that contains the new modified elements in there. So as before, besides the city, you could also have access to your index, and you can also, you could have access to the index, and you can also have access to your cities array. Now, as I mentioned before, if you just want to console log out your city, like so, right? In this case, it doesn't really make much sense to use the map function because that's not what it's meant to be used for. Semantically, it makes a lot more sense to use the forEach method, right? Because in this case, we just want to iterate over the elements and we want to console log out the city. In this case, we don't even need access to the index or the cities array. So we just remove those, and the other console log doesn't make any sense, so we can kill it. So this just gives us access to all the cities. And if your objective is just to simply iterate over the elements of the array, forEach is perfectly fine. If you want to get a new array, if you want to process the elements of the array, maybe apply some kind of a logic to them or modify them in any shape or form, then using map makes more sense for that. Now the very last approach I want us to look at is the for-of iterator, or the for-of loop. And this is basically the reason why we're doing this video. It's the new for-of syntax that's been added in ES6. And the way it looks is something like this. So you might have your for loop with the city of cities. Now notice the new of keyword. This is not the in as you would use for objects. This is the for of, like so. And we could just simply do console log city. And as you would expect, this is going to give us the 5 elements of the array. Now, so far, this is the most elegant approach because we don't have the boilerplate code like we typically would with, let's say, a traditional for loop where we have to define the indexes and all the other variables that have nothing to do with the objective of our code. But in this case, you need to remember that if you're using the for-of loop, it makes sense to use it as long as you don't need to have access to the index of the elements, right? Because in this case, we just get the element itself. And the other caveat is that the for-of loop is not natively supported on older browsers like, let's say, Internet Explorer. So if you need to support the older browsers, you need to make sure that you use polyfills, or you can also use the Babel preprocessor, the Babel library. In fact, if your objective is to be as cross-browser compatible as possible, then you could just use the traditional for loop because it goes way back to Internet Explorer 6 or something like that. Now, when it comes to other approaches when working with arrays, of course, you could use the traditional while loop. You could also use the reversed for loop or the reversed while loop. And the way those work is that you basically start at the index of length minus 1 and you work your way backwards to 0. So you're sort of like going from the last element of the array to the first one. That sort of makes sense when the order of elements is relevant. Now, the other thing you could also do is you could use the filter method on the array, and it basically allows you to get a brand new array with the elements that pass a given test, and your test would basically be inside of your callback function, right? You could also use the new ES6 syntax with the arrow functions, like so. The other approach you might take is you might use the sum function on your array, and the sum function, it basically checks whether at least one element of the array passes a given test. Lastly, you could also use the every function if it does make sense in your case, in your scenario. That function essentially allows you to check whether all of the elements of the array pass a given test. And again, the test would be inside of your callback function, right? And the very last thing I want to mention is if you're dealing with utility libraries like jQuery, Lodash, underscore, I already mentioned those. They do have their own built-in methods. Typically, it's each or for each. There might be some other implementations. And libraries, even like Angular, they might have their own implementation of the for each iterator. Now, that's about it for this lesson. Thanks a lot for checking out my channel, and I'm going to see you in the next episode.